The United States has had, like every country, certain fantasies about itself. One fantasy is of an exceptional place whose job it is to export democracy to other parts of the world. But even in the case of the United States, that fantasy has an opposite fantasy, which is an isolationist fantasy, if you will, an idea that the United States can be apart from the rest of the world.
Democratization is by definition always a policy of destabilization, because essentially what you're doing is going into a non or anti-democratic culture, a political culture, and deposing it, and in its wake leaving a lot of debris and a lot of ambitions for something better. If democracy does not grow from within, indigenously, on the basis of internal factors, there is nothing that the United States can do. Even being the most powerful state in human history, there is nothing that the United States can do to make another society democratic.
Well, in 2015, there'll still be probably the blowback, to put at least, of the war in Iraq. 2015, after all, is only 8 years from now. I would imagine that American forces will be either in Iraq or near Iraq in 2015. The Americans have gotten themselves into a situation from which there's no obvious exit. Exactly the kind of the economist Schumpeter, so much admired by neoconservatives, talked about creative destruction. Well, I'm not sure about the creative part, but certainly the Schumpeterian destruction is what has taken place in Iraq. And I mean, I think it was a calamity, but now it's a calamity we're stuck with.
I think the war in Iraq was a mistake, and I think it will be remembered as a mistake. And as somebody who supported the war and wrote on its behalf, I hold myself partially responsible for that mistake. The really exasperating dimension of the discussion now is that the sordid origins of the war have absolutely no bearing upon the question of how to get out of it. And you know, Bush said one thing in his move weapons of mass destruction that were not there. We are now fighting various terrorist groups in Iraq that were also not there when we went in. You know, I have to say, for years now I've thought I have absolutely nothing useful to say about this problem, because if I could say that we should get out immediately, that would be useful, but I think it would be wrong. And if I say that we should deploy another 150,000 troops, that might be useful, but I think it might be wrong.
But what is true, clearly, is that India and China are returning, for the first time in half a millennium, to the economic role they played roughly before 1500. That in economic terms, the multipolar world has already begun, and usually, without being a vulgar materialist, the economic terms are followed by political and military terms sooner or later. At that point, large parts of the world are going to have no reason to be pro-American, as they did as some parts of the world. This is not true, incidentally, in Latin America. I think you're just going back to, if you like, the pre-Cold War world, where people have there's no tropism, there's no magnet saying, you must look at the United States as a great model, you must. So, anti-Americanism? No, I think just multipolarity is a more accurate way of accounting for it.
My own view is that anti-Americanism right now is the single greatest problem for American foreign policy. I think it even affects the problem of American security insofar, if terrorism is a threat made by stateless actors, the control or elimination of which requires the cooperation of many states and many stateless bodies, it's perfectly it's perfectly clear that anti-Americanism will have some impact even upon the American security situation.
On one hand, it feels as if everything has changed, and on the other side, it feels as if nothing has changed. There's a tremendous panic, which is reflected. I'm sure many of you travel to the United States, and you know what it's like in an airport to be a foreigner in an airport, for example. It was never pleasant, but now it's ridiculous. There is other kinds of panic. People are now accustomed to showing identity documents not just in public buildings, state buildings. On the other hand, the country still reflects very much President Bush's basic statement in the aftermath of 9/11, which was keep shopping. There was a sense in which this government, the Bush administration, wanted nothing to change.
It is ridiculous to suggest, as people in Washington do, that Al-Qaeda or jihadism or Islamic fundamentalism pose any philosophical threat or any threat to the American way of life. During the Cold War, there was a time, in the 30s, 40s, even earlier certainly, because socialism and communism used the same vocabulary as liberalism. It was essentially the Enlightenment vocabulary. There was a sense in which you could argue that there was a war of ideas between the United States and the Soviet Union. There is no war of ideas as far as American society is concerned between George Bush and Osama bin Laden. But there is a real physical threat.
Without holding any brief for Hugo Chavez, and I think he's a disgraceful populist, I nonetheless think that the idea that somehow, if Latin America, the sort of Alvaro Vargas Llosa view I think expressed here not so long ago, that if only Latin America could sort of embrace neoliberalism full-throatedly, all will be well, is equally nonsensical. There's the idea that somehow the alternatives in Venezuela can be posited as Chavismo and anti-Chavismo seem to be basically to concede the field to Chavez. Because at that point, if the poor are going to choose simply between the old regime and Hugo Chavez, they're going to choose Hugo Chavez. And that's the reality. So unless and until another kind of liberal politics in this continent, can be developed, it seems to me you're going to get many Hugo Chavezes.